afternoon, everybody, and welcome to UWC, those of you who are not from this campus. I know that we have people watching us already on live streaming, so that is very encouraging. And of course, I'd like to welcome Tom again. He was with us last year, and he's very kindly offered to come and update us on copyright issues. I like it that Tom actually has a PhD in law as well as information studies. And I know that we have somebody in our midst here, Grace, who also has a law degree and has a postgraduate diploma in law and information studies. So I'm very excited also to have her here because she's in our UWC Library. And we were just talking about that this morning. How necessary it is these days to have a law degree, it seems, to work in academic libraries. But yeah, we're very excited to have Tom to come and update us. He attends WIPO, and I think he's just been there recently. So he'll be able to update us on what's going on. And then also, I think he's going to talk a little bit about our new draft bill. Actually, it's not a draft anymore, a new bill, revised bill on copyright in South Africa. So I'm sure that many of you had a look at the draft and at the bill. We'll have a few questions for him. But thank you, Tom, for making yourself available again.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you again for attending this talk, of those that are here with us live and those that are streaming. And I will say that we will make the slides available as well. So some of the slides have a lot of content, but they're more that you can use them as a resource. I'll just kind of give some of the highlights. So what I would like to do is to talk a little bit about what's happening internationally. As Sandy alluded to, I'm a member of the delegation for IFLA to WIPO, and that committee that looks at copyright issues meets twice a year. It just finished meeting at the beginning of May, and it will meet again in November. So the first bullet point there in the list under are some issues that WIPO is beginning to look at. And then I'll talk a little bit about the South African copyright bill. It's an extensive piece of legislation, so there's so much to say, and I may just give you some of the highlights. And it really is a far-reaching and forward-thinking piece of legislation. So you should, for all those that were either behind the scenes or in front of the scenes working on that bill, you should thank them if you ever have the opportunity, because there's some wonderful pieces, provisions in there in terms of libraries. And then one piece that isn't in there is fair use and the adoption of a set of standards for evaluating fair use that really do mirror what we have in the United States. So I just want to finish up with a little bit of what that looks like in the United States and some recent cases that are relevant to educators and librarians, and then hopefully have time for some questions at the end. So the first issue that WIPO is considering and looking at, and that IFLA has been promoting and advocating for, is a new treaty or some type of instrument on exceptions and limitations for libraries. And that was the most recent prompting for that. Part of that process of consideration is a report done by Professor Cruz, where he surveyed the world's copyright laws related to exceptions and limitations for libraries, and found that there was a fair amount of variation. There were some countries that really didn't have many provisions that addressed the needs of libraries and archives. Some countries included museums in that. also, also developing along with that was a couple of studies that have been done looking at exceptions and limitations and trying to tie that to a person's or country's productivity, especially in the information sector. So there's a study, the Lisbon study that came out, and then there's some kind of contrary citation criticizing this study. But the point is why this is important, and important to us at WIPO, is that there are a number of NGOs that are present there, IFLA being one of them, and there are other information advocacy groups. The Library Copyright Alliance is there, for example. But there are also a lot of NGOs representing the content industry and publishing industry, and their sort of mantra has been that if you have an exception and limitation, it means we're going to be actually losing revenue, losing sort of catalyst for innovation. And there's a lot of studies and a lot of evidence showing that that's not the case, and that actually having robust exceptions and limitations is helpful to a knowledge economy. So that sort of sets the scene, and this is a little more detail from the Lisbon study, and it's ranking the United States and the United Kingdom, which recently revised its copyright law a few years ago, fairly high because both those countries have a fair amount of robust exceptions for limitations in libraries, many of which, as you will see, would be in the South African new legislation if the bill is enacted. So I did a study with one of my doctoral students who's also a lawyer, and we sort of tried to map a sample based upon a conference that we had attended, and mapping that against the issues that WIPO, the SCCR, the Copyright Committee, has been looking at. And so there's general sort of framework for exceptions and limitations for libraries, library lending, interlibrary loan, there's reproduction rights, generally preservation rights, and there are lending rights that extend across the border. But what is unusual, and you'll see by the arrows there, is what is beginning to be called, or at least I refer to it as a contractual override provision, which says that certain rights that might be granted in a particular provision or might be granted under your copyright law cannot be overridden by a contract, cannot be overridden by a license agreement. So that maybe you're getting resources in your library that says that maybe it's a thesis or PhD database, and a common provision with those types of resources is to say you can lend them, but you can't lend them electronically. Under many of the exceptions and limitations that countries have, you can lend them electronically. You can treat them just like any other interlibrary loan document. So the idea of contractual override is becoming more and more important in terms of the world stage, because more and more of our content is acquired through a contract, through a license agreement. And the South African new bill would have that in it. The UK has a provision in that, in new copyright law. But something that would also be in the South African bill, and I'll talk about that in more detail, is what is referred to on the far right as TPMs, or technological protection measures. So you can have all rights in the world as a library or an archive, but if you've signed a license agreement that says, well, you can't do a right that's permitted under the copyright law, you contracted that right away. Similarly, with a technological protection measure, you may have the ability to replace damaged audiovisual materials, but if it's a DVD that's protected by CSS, content scrambling system, or some other type of technology, in many countries' laws, it's illegal to circumvent that TPM. So those are two ways that rights get taken away sort of automatically through a non-legislative process. So we did some of that mapping and concluded that there's a serious threat, and the study was looking just at grade literature, but even a lot of that literature is subject to license agreements now. So WIPO is considering a range of those provisions that you saw in the last graph. IFLA is trying to promote an instrument that would address all of those, because as the pre-study reports, there's wide variation across countries of the world. Another issue that the copyright committee is looking at in WIPO are provisions for education. And again, the process or pattern has been in WIPO to conduct, to commission some type of a study or a scoping report. And so we had a similar report presented at SCCR 33. So May was 34, last fall in November was 33, and this fall will be SCCR 35, so that's what the slash number means. So again, wide variety of variation in some provisions. Mr. Singh concluded that all the provisions he looked at across the world that could find related to education in the copyright law fell into a series of 8 categories. So there was private and personal use allowed, ability publications, educational publications for students, school performances, reproductions for educational purpose, including single multiple copies, educational communication, so you can transmit the content out, which is important to distance education. And then there were some provisions that started to look at compulsory licensing for education, and a new trend that he discovered or observed was again the increased use of technological protection measures and maybe some type of an override right or circumvention right, so that the educational use can still continue in spite of material that's subject to these TPMs. So he's going to give an update report this fall, and if the pattern continues at WIPO, what will happen is there will be these 8 issues or 8 clusters probably will be split up, and they may go through them one at a time and ask the member states to comment, and then ask the NGOs to comment. So one theme that is encouraging at WIPO is that now that education is on the table along with libraries and archives, we see more NGOs representing, again, both sides, users and educators and advocates, as well as the content industry. But we're starting to get a larger and a louder voice of NGOs that are concerned about providing access to information, whether that's through the library, the archive, whether it's through the classroom, and of course it's NGOs. Well, no, online education is so important to many countries around the world. Another issue that WIPO has recently started to look at again is access to persons with disabilities. Now, you may know or heard of the Marrakesh Treaty, which is now effective because there were a sufficient number of signatory countries that have been enacted, contracting parties. But oddly, the Marrakesh Treaty only applies to those with visual impairments. So print disabled, visual disabled. And an original version, or an early version of the proposed Marrakesh Treaty had this clause in there that said, or any other disability. So now we're finding that there are still many users around the world, even if Marrakesh is enacted in your country, that are still left out of the points of access because they have different types of disabilities. Could be physical, could be cognitive, could be visual, could be oral. So there's a thought then that maybe we need to amend or create a new instrument that is more broadly speaking. And you'll see in your South African bill this concept of really anybody with an impairment can have the advantage of that vision. It's not just the visually impaired. So there's a little more detail in this study. And again, the report, Professor Nkube from University of Cape Town, along with Professor Blake Reed, they presented. Professor Reed had some of his students who've been working on the project from the University of Colorado. And they presented a preliminary report. My bullet points are from that preliminary report, and they're going to give a full report in November. So there's going to be a number of issues that are going to be right front and center in terms of WIPO's plate. Another proposal, which is in your South African bill, is to consider a resale right for certain creative artists. So this would be similar to a tax or a royalty payment, if you want to look at it that way, every time a work of art is sold. And many of the countries that were supporting this original proposal were those that were part of the French colonial system. And so they've inherited a very strong sense of moral rights that are really apart from the copyright in a work. So it feels a lot like a moral right, because it's every time, and this is a right that is owed to the creator. And so there was a preliminary report, a final report, and the problem, or one of the issues, is how do you create the incentives, because some of the studies, the preliminary data shows that some of the artists that have the most to gain under a system like this are those artists that are sometimes older in their career because they're finally famous enough that their work is selling for high price tags. And then the other issue that they've discovered based on some examples of jurisdictions that try to employ some type of process like that is that if everybody doesn't do it, it's kind of like the economics of networks. If everybody doesn't do it, then what happens is merely the sales move to a country that doesn't have to pay this penalty, if you want to look at it that way, that the purchaser doesn't have to pay this. So whether they embrace this or not, there's a lot of countries that, because of the first sale doctrine, believe that once the first sale occurs, the creator or the copyright holder should not receive any more compensation. So whether they come up with another plan, whether they create some sort of tax system or some other sorts of a tax at the initial sale, it remains to be seen, but it is on the table. And then most recent discussion, which hasn't even led to the study stage yet, is a proposal from what's known as the GRULAC group. So at WIPO there are groups of countries. There's an African group, there's a group B, to generally developed countries, and there's a GRULAC, which is Latin American countries. And it's a proposal to study streaming and the impact of streaming on artists and creators' rights and remuneration. And so it's about digital content, and the GRULAC presented this proposal, and it was discussed now, and there is a sort of a working group of experts apparently going to be producing some type of a report or preliminary report on that. And it's just a proposal right now, but the concern that is expressed in the document for further review by GRULAC is that we don't really have the transparency in terms of streaming. There's many artists that claim their works are being streamed and consumed many more times than they seem to be receiving royalties for it. And is that an issue with the algorithms, with the search patterns? There's all sorts of concerns that they're raising. So that's what's going on at WIPO right now. So it's the fullest plate. I've been going there for maybe 3 years or so now, and it's a loaded agenda in terms of exceptions and limitations and issues. So we will be very busy, I'm sure, in November. So then we want to take a little bit of time and look at your own proposed bill, and it's a dense piece of legislation. There's so many things that are in it. It has some definitional provisions, and I just pulled a few. There's a number of definitions, but as I mentioned a few moments ago, that concept of disability is not limited to print, so it has a very broad idea of a person that is disabled. It defines commercial, and in terms of, because there's many exceptions that are limited to non-commercial use, and you still have to consider not only the actual financial gain, but is there some economic advantage? And that seems to suggest, look, at least judging from a concept like that and an appearance of it in our law in the United States, that cost recovery and things like that is not going to be considered advantage or gain. And there's an addressing of the issue of orphan works, which are works that we believe are still protected by copyright, but we don't know who the author or owner is, and so we don't know who to ask for permission. And libraries being fairly risk averse in the sense of legal consequences and trying to always do the right thing, many times the network isn't used, and that's not in the public interest. And then it defines copyright management information, technological protection measures, things of that sort. I'll have a little bit more to say about that later on. So there's a definition section, there's a scope section, and it sort of makes certain acknowledgments. One is the idea expression dichotomy. That's what we call it in U.S. law, but it's essentially the concept that the copyright doesn't protect the idea, it only protects the expression of it. And then the Berger doctrine is really sort of related to that, which says that, yeah, but if there are only a limited number of ways to express an idea, then those two concepts merge, and we have the supremacy, if you will, of that idea concept, that you can't copyright that idea. And in our case law, we've had examples of hold-on menus on software programs. So there's only a limited number on a flat screen to figure out how people navigate. And so your bill just says, no, let's, rather than wait for a court case to come up, let's just state that these ideas are embedded in our copyright law. It recognizes compilation copyrights, creativity in how you organize data, and it talks about government works and the exclusion of government works, certain legal administrative works and political speeches from being protected by copyright. And again, my reaction to some of those provisions is that, yeah, it took us case law to figure that out. And your bill just sort of sets it on the table right from the beginning. It does introduce a concept of state copyright. So the state can own certain works. And it does establish a resale rate, as I mentioned before. It would be a public process set on what that rate would be. And some people recommend 1%, some people recommend 5%, more than that. So there'll be a process to set that rate. And then there's, again, these are just some of the highlights from the provision. It applies when the author is a citizen or a resident in the jurisdiction in South Africa. The royalty period is not expired. Okay. And then that period for a known author is like plus 50. Unknown is unknown uses the date of publication. And a few more provisions because it's thought if it's under sort of a moral rights umbrella, it's not really a property right, it's a quasi-property right. So you can't treat it like a property completely. So it's non-assignable. You can't give it to somebody else, and you can't waive it. And there's a provision that restores the right if it would have lapsed because you don't know the author, and it's published in year zero, let's say, 50 years later, we don't know who the author is, the right will expire. But now what if all of a sudden in the 55th year we figure figure out, oh, no, we knew that. Now we find out who the author is. And the author is still alive. So that right will still be going, beyond the author's death. So it can restore those rights. Then Section 10 is fair use. And the way it's structured now, there's a section that lists all sorts of uses. You see there, the two I thought were interesting or worth note is preservation. Because under our fair use case law, as you'll see, we haven't addressed that issue yet. And then this idea of fair use being also for serving underserved populations. And there's not a lot of definition about that, so I'm not sure how that would really play out. It may take, as in countries with fair use, some case law to tease those sorts of things out. Then there's a section, the next section has basically those 4 fair use factors that we have. Puts them in a different order, but it's essentially the nature of the work. And in the brackets I have, if you're further reading about U.S. case law, or when I talk about fair use, you'll see the order is different. So that's because what is your first factor is our second factor, what is your second factor is our third factor, and what's your third factor is our first factor, but essentially the same provisions. There's a little more detail added in your provision. There's discussion about a different purpose, which you'll see in U.S. law is this idea of transformative use. So again, that's one of the advantages of the bill is it sort of lays some things right out on the table, so we don't have to go to the case law to develop that. And it talks about the emphasis on the potential market being the substitution effect, and that's something that our case law is continuing to discuss now. Is it a substitute effect? Because if it is, then it tends to weigh against fair use, and so it sort of incorporates that piece into there right now. And then there's a section C that seems to suggest that the group of the factors in A and the factors in B are 2 separate sets of circumstances. And there's a paper or a statement that's been presented by Denise Nicholson from Wits University and others saying, well, we need to insert a clause in there that says such as into that group, that first group that I showed you, to make it to have it be structured more like the U.S. provision, so that the 2 sections, it seems, really aren't supposed to be independent of each other. These are examples of what you can get to in fair use when you apply the 4 factors. And it seems that was intended, but that's not quite the way it was written. So there may be some changes like that. And then there's a whole list of exceptions, some of which we have concluded through our fair use law or statute are fair uses, but this lists them right here, but it adds some new ones too. It talks about lawful broadcast by a broadcaster and recording that for some type of preservation or archive purposes. Translation provision in terms of related to instruction. And some other ones. So bona fide demonstration of electronic equipment. I'm not sure if that provision was prompted by a case. It's not clear what bona fide means, but that's one I've not seen in other countries. Judicial proceedings, again, similar to that other sort of public domain provision before. Personal use, which again lays out on the table, backup copy, time or format shifting, and that's an expansion over some countries' concepts, and adaptation and translation. So a number of rights. Parallel importation, that's the idea that if a work is lawfully made in one country, then you are allowed to import it into your country, even if it may or may not be lawful in your country. If it's lawfully made, you have the right to import it in under the exhaustion or first sale doctrine. And that's an issue that Whitewell has been talking about as well for libraries. And then this basically gives that right to an individual. So if you're travel to another country and you find something that's protected by copyright and you purchase it, so you're the owner of that copy, you're allowed to bring it into the country. Large education provision, generally by a person for education, so there's rules about textbooks and limits on that. All right. And then institutional, so again, clear, things like course packs, reserves, even theses, dissertations, portfolios, institutional repositories, so it supports open access concepts. And some of these provisions have been the subject of litigation in the United States or other countries. Some of them have not been contemplated yet by the courts. So again, your bill, I think, is very proactive in saying, well, no, let's not wait till this comes up again and we need to litigate it. Let's list all of these types of educational, related, or connected uses where we might want to put that and might want to have those provisions be available. There's also provision, again, tied to open access and public funding of research that says that, that must be, there's 12-month embargo period, but after that period, it has to be available to an open access. There's a more technical provision that applies to interoperability and what might be referred to as possibly reverse engineering of a program to make sure it's compatible. I need to be able to get it the code so I can write a program that lets me use it on another device, things of that sort. And then a large section on libraries, archives. Your bill has added museums, which WIPO is considering, but it's also added galleries. And that's something I haven't seen extensively really in other countries' provisions. So there's a basic lending rate. There's performance viewing, even in the library. There's a reiteration of parallel importation. There's an immunity provision. Very strong sections for libraries. And then again, in a specific provision, you saw the definition of disability, but persons with disability. And again, lawful access to none of those change the work, but you can make or supply. So that would mean it's an accessible format. So that might be required in some type of a server or website or transmitting it to someone. Moral rights section, attribution, presentation of typical moral rights. So the author has a right, a separate right from copyright to be attributed to that work. The author or creator has a separate right to control how the work is presented. So someone else may own the copyright of a work of art and want to display it, but there's kind of a presentation display right that if somehow the claim can be that it's distorting the nature of the work, that there's a moral right that the creator can claim. And one of the cases that is sometimes cited is from Canada about, and there's many other cases from France as well, where a sculpture was in a shopping mall, and there was a flight of geese, that they had suspended from the ceiling. And around Christmas time, the mall had put like Christmas lights on it, and was decorating it. And the artist said, "Well, this is really kind of insulting to my sculpture," and litigated and was successful. So there would be some type of a presentation right, and again, like with the resale right, it's non-transferable and non-waivable. There's a provision on orphan works solved through a licensing payment remuneration mechanism, which is similar to what some of the proposals in Europe and other countries have adopted. There is a search required, and commission, may indicate to you, what those requirements are of a, sometimes call it a diligent search, in some countries formation. But a number of things you have to check. You have to use a database if it's available. You have to use technology tools, you have to check resources that you might know of. So that provision works well when there's some best practices in place. So it may take a while to understand what those best practices are in South Africa. But once that's done, then it's an easy checklist to sort of proceed through. So, okay, we've done our diligent search and we're satisfied with the record. Large provision on establishment of collecting societies, which I know much less about, so I'm not going to try and necessarily comment on that. It has a broad definition of infringement that includes not only copyright management information, but failing to pay a lease or royalty right, as well as infringement. And it uses the word misuse as copyright. It's not defined, and I don't know enough about South African copyright law to know whether you have case law on the misuse of copyright, but it's a specific term in U.S. law. So that may need to be teased out, or at least the court case is consulted to see what was meant by that, and then TPM, technological protection measures. And so then there's a huge series of sections on technological protection measures and what's prohibited. So you can't circumvent, right? And there's exceptions coming up. But, so generally the rule is you can't circumvent. You can't publish or share information, what some countries call trafficking, with intent to induce someone to circumvent. Okay? And so someone would have to prove intent. Providing a device, like it could be a piece of software, that as you know, it reasons it's going to be used to infringe. Or provides some service that assists people in infringing. So in the U.S., we've had case law involving Grokster, Aimster, and Amster, all those types of sites. And there's civil penalties and imprisonment for doing that. And the reason why there are countries with these types of provisions now is that the WIPO Copyright Treaty of 1996 had these provisions in there. So adopting and enacting countries have to put some type of TPM in there. Again, you can always craft it the way that you want to apply it in your country. You can have exceptions. There's further prohibitions in the next section with everything sort of repeated, except it says when you know that the user of your service intends to use the service to circumvent and affect the TPM. I'm not sure how you would know that unless you ask them, and the user would say, yes, I'm going to circumvent. But short of that, I'm not sure how you would determine that. And then there's a huge exception, which I haven't seen. It's not in the UK provision. I've not seen it anywhere else, and that says, which is what many people have been arguing the problem with TPMs is that if you have a technological protection measure, and then you have a right or a privilege that's of a user under copyright law, the TPM can essentially unilaterally take away your right to do that. But your law says, well, no, as long as you're going to make a lawful use of that work, once you break it open, once you circumvent, then you're allowed to circumvent. And that, to me, that's logical, but it's not the way a lot of countries' laws are structured. And you can even go to the author, to the owner, and ask, well, you got this TPM. We don't want to just start in the practice of hacking. Could you give us that key? And then if they say no, then there's a provision where you can seek the assistance of a third party. So there may be a new industry coming up in South Africa, which is, circumventions are us or something like that. So it gives you the right to seek that assistance. Under some country structures, that type of sharing of information of how to circumvent might be fall under the trafficking rules. So your law says no. If it's going to be a lawful use, you can't control that access to that use. And then there's a copyright management information. That's sometimes for that digital rights management. That's the other piece of the '96 WIPO Treaty. And so you're trying to comply with that treaty. So you have provisions about that. And the provision is initially written to be strict liability that I can't circumvent. remove CMI. What is CMI? CMI is author information other rights, other metadata that would tell you about who the author, the owner is, the copyright holder is, and it might tell you the terms and conditions. So content that's distributed through a license agreement, like a CC license, and that those terms are embedded into that information, into that content, that's copyright management information. But then there's a huge exception that says, well, you can't, it's only going to apply the prohibition of removing that information if you know or have reason to know. So in other words, you have to, you can't, this is not a strict liability provision. So you have to know or have reason to know that content copyright management information is being removed. So it's basically a rule that just says keep it in place, don't remove it yourself. Or if you know that it's been removed. Then there's an intellectual property tribunal which is established, and one of the things they're going to do is to set some of these rates for some of the new licenses, digital rates, things of that sort. And then here's one of the last significant provisions that I want to talk about, and this is a contractual override. So in addition to having your rights taken away by a TPM, that a content holder could put on there, they could also be taken away by a license agreement that you're signing. And I put the whole text of the provision in there because I think it's really important. It says, to the extent that a term of a contract purports to prevent or restrict the doing of anything that would be lawful under the statute. So all the new rights that are in the rest of the bill, if a provision wants to take that away, or if it somehow forces you by its terms to renounce a right that is protected under your copyright law, then that term is simply unenforceable. And so again, we fight hard for exceptions, limitations in the copyright law for users, because at least in my opinion, copyright is about balance. It's about achieving certain ends and trying to structure a law that helps you achieve those ends. And so there's copyright holders' rights and there's users' rights. That's part of the bargain. But if you can allow a contract to take all those rights away, kind of changes the nature of the bargain. This clause says you can't do that. Now there are some exceptions for open access licenses, moral rights settlement agreements, terms of service agreements, voluntary dedication of work to the public domain, but generally, your average database license from Cengage, or even like an iTunes license, is going to be unenforceable because there are restrictions in both those types of licenses. So I just want to talk, and maybe just 5 minutes, real quick, and then still time for questions. A little bit about fair use. So again, the factors are in a different order in your law, but they're essentially the same factors. So we look at the nature of the work. We try and figure out whether it's thick or thin. In other words, is it factual material like newspaper articles, or is it highly creative articles like thing pops? And the thought is that the thin works favor fair use. Sometimes courts will inquire whether it's unpublished or published. We've had some cases in the U.S. involving letters in an archive that haven't been published yet. And so then the court felt the lack of their publication tends to weigh against fair use. We look at the amount and substantiality, and I'll come back to factor one. I'm going to do a little bit in the order. So there's a two-part question to that. Now, what's the actual percent? How much? But then are you taking the heart of the work, the substantiality, the value? An example would be a movie trailer. Movie trailer is, a small percent of the work, but if it gives away the surprise ending, then you basically undermine the incentive for people wanting to consume that work. For many, many years, people are always fixated on how much. Is 10 seconds enough? Is 10 minutes? 3,000 words, 4,000 words, give me a number. Well, our courts have said that's far less important. What's more important is under the first factor is, are you taking only as much as is necessary to accomplish a good purpose? And that might be 100% in some cases. And then under the first factor, we want to ask whether it's commercial or non-commercial. If it's commercial, that thought, hey, maybe that weighs against fair use. But our courts are focused, and your law puts it right into the statute. Consider whether it's a substitute or whether it's a transformative use. It's a different purpose. It serves a different purpose. Because if it does, then that is that factor will favor fair use, because it's not damaging the market that the original copyright holder invested effort in developing. If I'm a news photographer, use of my photos as news, yes, that's a substitute. But use of my photos as an illustration or an example of something else, that's something you wouldn't expect as a photojournalist to get royalties from. It's a different purpose. And I'll show you more examples of that when we talk about a couple of quick cases. And then the impact of the market. And so copyright is a property right. So we have to consider the market impact. But what our cases have developed recently is that if it's a transformative market, that's not a market that the copyright owner can claim control of. And so, very important U.S. case law to figure out, well, what are transformative uses, okay? And your statute lists 8 categories of them. So here's a really quick example. I won't go through the slides. I'll just show you the pictures so you can kind of understand what's going on. So this was a case involving a history of the rock group Grateful Dead, and it was an illustrated history, so you can see lots of visuals. And part of the visuals were the use of a handful of posters. Now they were shrunk down to fit on the page, so it wasn't like they were reprinting posters. It wasn't like they reprinted them in a calendar that they expect people to hang on the wall. Or they were in a book they expect people to read. So they were sued by the copyright holder of the posters, this publisher. And they argued fair use, and the court agreed. Because they said, well, what is your use? What is the original purpose here? Well, it says pop art, and it's to promote the concert. Okay. But my use here is as an illustration or an example. And the court said that was a transformative use. Right? Nature of the work is creative. How much do they take? 100%. But they needed to, because if you were going to take some magic 10%, the bottom, tenth of it wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't illustrate or serve as an example. And then because it's a transformative market, this court said the copyright owner might want to get money from that and maybe found some other people to pay for it. But if it's a fair use market, a transformative fair use market, then it's not under the control of the copyright owner. Just because you didn't pay for it, but you did. The courts will say that is not market harm. Here's another case, simple example. Broadway show, The Jersey Boys. In the play, I show if you've ever seen it. It's not in the movie if you watch the movie, but it's in the play. They show a 7-second clip of Ed Sullivan introducing the Four Seasons that the story was based on. And they got sued. And the court said it's a fair use. Because the reason for using the clip is not to rebroadcast an Ed Sullivan TV show. Okay? It's the court said to use this as a historical marker, as an example, as placing it in time. And so, the court said it's a transformative market, transformative use, a different purpose. So the court concluded this was a fair use as well. So in education, we use copyrighted materials as examples and illustrations all the time. So it supports education. And I just want to mention quickly some of the data mining cases and the mass digitization cases that we've had. So this is one of the early ones. It involved an anti-plagiarism database that Turnitin software, the iParadigms company that produces that software, maintains. And they were sued by the students of one school system. Say, you got our papers in your database. And the company claimed fair use. And the court said to go through the factors. First factor, what's the purpose? It's not as a substitute for student papers, okay? Because there's been cases like that. I mean, the Widener-Carroll decision on the second bullet point there is a case involving a website that was selling term papers. And it infringed the copyright of the students' papers that they were using. This case was not doing it. This case was merely maintaining copies of those papers so it could match new submissions against their database and see whether there was plagiarism. How much did they take? They took 100%. But if you've got a full text retrieval system, it's not going to work with 10% of each paper, or even 75% of each paper. Because how do you know what you're looking for is not in the last 1%. So the court said you're justified in taking all of the work in this case. So very similar to some of those other cases. And then we've had, we read about these cases, the high trust decision. So there are several cases revolving around the Google books. And what this case involved was when the libraries in the United States gave Google their materials to scan so that Google could create its Google book search, they sent a digital copy back to the libraries. And the HathiTrust, a consortium of those libraries, created a database that you could search as well. And you would retrieve page numbers. You put in a term, put in a query, and you get page numbers and books where your term occurs. So the authors sued the HathiTrust, and there were 3 issues that were argued in the case. It's fair use because it's data mining. It's fair use because it helps us give access to our students with disabilities. And 3, we use it as a source of the replacement right, the replacement privilege that libraries have. Well, the court didn't get to the replacement preservation issue, and that's why I pointed it out in your provision under fair use, why preservation is really an intriguing one, because I don't know if our courts haven't addressed that squarely yet. So it went through the full text searching and concluded it's a quintessentially transformative use. Publishers don't publish books, authors don't write books so people can data mine them. They write them so people can read them. The fact that someone else creates a tool to allow people to figure out, well, what books are relevant for me to read, that's a transformative use. It's not a substitute for the book. So the court included that in terms of full text searching, text data mining, that's a fair use. Now what's interesting is I see a provision in more and more licenses that prohibit text and data mining. But again, it's a transformative market. So even though a licensor might try and get you to pay for it, okay, you don't have to. And moreover, under your bill, that contract term is unenforceable if data mining is a fair use. And then they looked at the accessibility issue, and the only interesting point I'll make here is that the court said, well, you know what, there's really not anything transformative about that, because the person with the disability is going to consume the content. They're going to read the book as well as anyone else. But it's still a valid purpose under the first factor, even though it's not transformative. So that's a significant statement, at least for our law. But again, you don't have to worry about going to fair use for some of these uses because you have a great disability provision. So included this fair use, and then it said as far as preservation goes, we couldn't figure that out. This is Google Books, so now you've moved out of the academic environment, non-commercial environment, moved into the commercial environment, because Google is clearly a commercial entity. This is clearly commercial use. But it's also transformative, because again, it's a full text retrieval system. It's data mining, all these millions of books, looking for the reference to one little minute thing. That's transformative. And the Second Circuit ultimately concluded that this was a fair use as well. And then they have a very interesting quote. Which says that the very last bullet point there, if the library had created its own digital copy to enable fair use search databases. Now, what the difference in Google's retrieval is you get the snippets here. You don't just get a page. But the court is suggesting here that, well, even if you gave more than just the page numbers, the High Trust would have been engaging in a fair use. The library would be engaging in a fair use if you build, you digitize works, make them allowable to be searchable, text and data mining. You don't give away the whole work, but you let a person know, hey, here's enough of this work for me to figure out whether this is really relevant to my information need. That can be a fair use. So, the support for a lot of library type digitization projects, whether it's done by a commercial entity, like iParadigms or Google, whether it's done by a nonprofit like High Trust. Again, just in conclusion, there's, as I said, there's relationships within our factors. Your courts may continue to tease those out, or they may adopt some of our relationships. Again, the first and the third are very tightly connected. How much is often related to what is your purpose? How much do you need in order to accomplish that purpose? And we're out of time, so I'll just pass by this and give you an example. So if you want some homework, this is a case which, so there was a photo of then Senator Barack Obama, former president, that was used to create a poster, and there was litigation. Litigation settled. We don't have a court decision. But if you want to start to practice fair use for its day of enactment in South Africa, you can take a stab at trying to figure out whether it's transformative or not, whether it's commercial or not. Is it a substitute for the original? What's the nature of the work? How much do they take? Here's 100%, obviously. Or at least if you look at, there are a couple versions of the photographs, so did they look at changes of that profile? Was it this whole shot? Was it that photo or was it this photo? So you can play around with that one. And then the fourth factor is their market. In other words, this independent photojournalist, makes money by covering, this was the Washington Press Club, it's an annual lunch or what, by covering news events. That's their livelihood. This artist uses that as some type of screen art to give a message, yes, but is that really going to impact the ability or the desire of photojournalists like this individual to continue to cover Washington Press Club launches? So that's another way of asking that question about marketing. And I think I have an answer key. So
what's the answer?
Well, I can't tell you what the case law says, because there is no case law. But I mean, if you look at the first factor, the way I would analyze this is to say, well, how much are you taking? Okay, let's assume that I am taking 100%. That the photo I had was really his whole profile. My point is, well, could I achieve the message? Brahma red, white, and blue, USA, hope for the country, you know, however you want to craft that message, I would argue. Can I do that with just taking his eyes? You know, I need to know. Show me what it's Barack Obama. So I would say it's a transformative use of this photograph. And it's not impacting the market because this person is going to continue to cover news events by potential presidential candidates. There are counter arguments, but I mean, I would conclude this is a fair use. But the party settles, so I won't know. But there are similar cases of screen art print, photographs into posters and art and things like that. And sometimes they're fair use and sometimes they're not. But there's an answer key that I'll send along as well. Well, I think I went over a little bit, but I'm happy to take questions if there is time, and thank you so much for your attention. I know there's a lot of content, but your bill is extremely dense, as Sandy was admitting, and it's dense to me too. There's just a lot going on in that piece of legislation. Thank you.
I think we can take one or two questions. Are there any questions that you have? You have one?
Can I ask, so is that equation that you gave for fair use, that of the four clauses, is that how it's determined? And what is, I saw it's 1 or 0. So what is the formula for a fair use?
Right. So the pluses and minuses kind of like my own internal tracking. But if you do read a fair use case, you will see that the courts will always talk about them in exactly the same order they're presented in the statute. So you can get some sort of consistency into assessing them. And then they will often talk about the first factor, mention some prior cases that are like it or not like it, and then come to some kind of conclusion about the factor, that particular factor. Sometimes they'll say clearly, they'll use words like clearly or greatly favors fair use or doesn't favor fair use. So you can kind of start to keep score like I did. Like, okay, a plus is in favor of fair use, a minus is against. And then you go to the second factor, and then you have some discussion about that. And sometimes the second factor is one of those factors that we found in our cases that sometimes it's neutral, it doesn't really help. And the court will even use that word like neutral. So I put a 0 there because I don't know what it is. But sometimes you can have to read in a little bit. Sometimes the court's clear about, oh, this is thin copyright. This goes to the core of copyright protection. Very creative. You got to put a negative there, -1, and they'll proceed through the 4 factors like that. And then at the end, they'll come to some sort of conclusion factor. But well, the first factor did this, and the second factor did this, and the third factor did this, and the fourth factor did this. Therefore, it's fair use. So they do. I mean, they don't numerically say we're adding it up. But I kind of do that mentally just to track it myself. And I'm trying to think there may be a rare case out there where it's tied 2-2, but you hardly ever see ties. Because of the relationship between the factors. A lot of times, if the first factor isn't weighing against fair use, your purpose isn't a good one or it's commercial, it's having a market impact. One definition our courts have used is, are you failing to pay the customary price? It's substitutive, and you're failing to pay the price for that substitute. Then that weighs against fair use. And it may be that in some of those cases, the substitution effect, there's a positive correlation between how much you're taking sometimes and the substitution effect. So a lot of times the first and the third factor will always line up. And if the first and the third are lining up, say, against fair use, then you're probably going to have market harm. It's going to be pretty easy to find that. Whereas if the first and the third are weighing in favor of fair use, maybe because you're in a transformative market, then the courts will say there's no market harm. So then you get 3 to 4 to 1, or 4 to none, or 3 to 1. So I just and I use that as a learning tool for my students. So I can and that's why I say we'll have to develop a new nomenclature or be a little more explicit, because for a U.S. copyright lawyer, we won't even say the word privilege. We'll say, what did you read about the first factor discussion in the Google case? Everyone knows what the first factor is. Well, you're ordering yours differently. So we'll have to be very explicit that we're talking about, when we start to exchange conversations about the purpose of the work. Or you want to talk about the nature of the work. Okay, let's not use factor 1, 2, or 3, or 4. Let's talk about what that provision means. But it's useful for me to kind of look at it that way.
Do you have any other questions? Anybody would like? Yes?
One of the legal phrases you used, it was something like reasonable access or reasonable means to it, which had to be provided, otherwise it was an exemption. Now, for example, a book by 2 South African authors was sold for the sterling equivalent of 450 Rand. When I tried to order it from exclusive bookshop, they demanded 4,500 Rand. Now, is that reasonable in legal sense?
Yeah, so the concept of, sometimes having the provisions where you have to make a market search, and if it's not available at a reasonable price, then I want to say, without recalling the exact language, that I think there's a further elucidation, I'll say, in your bill that talks about that reasonable price being tied to the market, not just anywhere in the world. And so I think you might be able to have some movement on there in terms of saying, well, what's reasonable for a person where you are, not just the price that they want to charge you. But it's an issue that really hasn't come up in U.S. law, because when our U.S. law was written with that type of concept, and that concept appears in other countries' laws, if those clauses were written, at least in our law, on the day of print, not the day of global access to information. So I think I would say that you probably have to take a look at that provision and read it very carefully, but there may be some room to be able to argue that it's got to be what's reasonable for you, not what's reasonable for someone in the kingdom. But don't take my, I'm not promising that, but I think there's a little more wiggle room in your bill than there would be in some other countries' provisions that have that similar concept.
Thank you, John. Yes, I after listening to Tom, I read through the new bill, South African bill, copyright bill, and as I was reading through it, I was thinking, okay, there's a lot of legalese in it, yes. And my first response was also, this seems a lot more progressive than what we've had, and you seem to be confirming it. And I think some of the librarians here are also recognizing that. I would like to hand over to Addison from the library to just say a word of thanks.
I don't need this. I think maybe Tom, if I may. That was a real privilege. We could really feel that we were in the hands of a very seasoned expert, someone who speaks our language and understands our concerns, but has obviously travelled all the miles to WIPO and so on to defend some of them. So I just want to actually, it's really, I'm going to have to come and ask you, what's the environment like in WIPO? Because we tend to be quite passionate about copyright and open access and things like that, and it's difficult for me to imagine people discussing in a dispassionate, calm, neutral way. But I guess when you're in the hands of legal experts, it has to be so. But I really appreciate also your ability to offer us a comparative view of our new bill, particularly in the realm of fair use. So thank you very, very much. It was a very smooth ride, I assure you.
Little gift for Tom, which includes wine. It's Cape Town wine. Yes. And thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Maybe some fruits outside, so just check.
doesn't that also mean that librarians can scrutinize those contracts a little more closely?
Well, no, I mean, you should be supposed, in the absence of that, you still want to be scrutinized. You always
Yeah, but we
scrutinize
tend to just be timid.
because you want to